Well, hello there again. It's Gayle with BERNINA of Naperville, and it's time to quilt our Morse code quilt.
And you might recognize this project that we're working on as our May 2025 Fat Quarter of the Month project, where we use the circular embroidery attachment to applique perfect circles, and then we sewed it together into a quilt top. Well, today I'm going to show you how to quilt and finish this project.
And I decided I'm just going to use a walking foot, make a gentle curve, and then echo that curve across the whole quilt. Then I'm going to show you a few tips, tricks, and utensils that I use to do a perfect binding. So let's get started.
I'm going to quilt this with a walking foot on my Bernina 475 because I want to use a mid-size machine just so that you can see it's not impossible to do something awesome on those machines. So this quilt finishes at about 48.5 inches wide and 36.5 inches tall. So it's wider than it is tall. And I wanted to be careful for a couple of things. One, the backing that I got is non-directional here. And so this is what I'm going to put on the back. And then I've cut my batting. And my batting is about 6 inches, 4 to 6 inches larger on all sides than my quilt. And right now I just have the quilt top placed on the batting. It's not smoothed out or anything yet. So I'm just going to take this aside for a minute. And I'm going to take the backing fabric. Now, luckily, this quilt is the size is such that I can just use regular 45-inch wide fabric. And I'm not a pre-washer, but I did pre-wash the fabric for the top of my quilt. And so likewise, this is pre-washed as well. So we're going to take this guy and it's freshly pressed and crisped, right? And trimmed. But I do have a crease line through the middle from when I pressed it after I washed it. And so I want to be careful that that doesn't get a crease in it when I quilt. So I'm going to take this over to the iron and I'm going to press this crease out. Now you might also notice that I have a very nice big table here. It's actually two tables pushed together. They are the Eversone loft tables, and it's pretty nice. They're so wide that I can't even reach over across the table, so I have to walk around it a little bit. But here is the backing spread out, my non-directional backing. Now, I will be able to quilt this quilt in one setting without any problems whatsoever. So, with that in mind, I am going to go ahead and spray this with 505 spray. And another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to tape my backing to the table so I can position my batting without the fabric wiggling around on me. And I've got the blue tape that I use for this. I'm going to see if I can zoom out more. Okay, I can't zoom out anymore with my overhead camera, but I will show you how I'm just going to tape this down to the table. This is painter's tape. This isn't going to hurt anything. It's not going to leave a residue or anything like that. And I'm going to do this all around this backing. And also, I'm not trying to make it tight like a drum, but I do want to make sure that no folds, wrinkles, or waves are going to be left on this fabric. Now, I have the batting here. And remember, my fabric is sprayed, so I don't necessarily want to lay it down quite yet. What I want to show you is that batting has two sides. So this side looks really floofy and fuzzy, and this side looks more like where the needles penetrated the batting. That side where the needles penetrated the batting is the right side. So we want this side to go up, and that's because if we do it the other way, batting could creep up with our needle when we take our quilting stitches. And for the most part, this quilt has a dark background, so it will beard, and beard is where the batting creeps through the needle holes. So we don't want that. Another thing is we do want to manage how we put this onto our fabric there. So I'm folding my batting into quadrants. And sometimes you can roll the batting on a pool noodle if you want, but I'm going to do it this way. And I'm just going to picture like my batting going on, kind of like this here. And we're going to smooth this. Excuse my head. Here we go. And now we'll unfold it. And I didn't get it quite centered. So now the 505 spray is repositionable, so don't worry, but this is why we taped our fabric down. So we can do this a couple times if we need to. And now let's pull this over. Now you did see I have a little fuzzy wuzzy on the back of this batting right here. And if this were a white batting or a white backing, ooh la la, we'd want to get that out of there because that would definitely show through. Okay, so now there's that. I'm going to go over to the other side of the table now and do the same thing if I can reach it. I'd like at least 6 more inches in height if that could be possible. And now I am going to pick some of these little stray threads off. Sewing is a dusty, messy business, right? And remember, we want to get all the wrinkles out. So I'm just going to gently encourage this here. There we go. Now it's time to put the fabric piece on. Now, in this case, I do not use 505 quite yet. So I'm going to just line this up and I'm keeping the edges down at the bottom of my piece here parallel so everything is nice and straight. And remember, I did cut my batting a little bit larger than I need. This is not directional. It's not anything. If I didn't get it on there perfect, nobody cares. But you could use your ruler to measure the distance from your selvage to your quilt. It's about 3¼ on this end and 3¼ on this end. I didn't mean to do that. That was just a little happy accident. So now let's make sure I smooth it out on the other side there. And I can't remember if I said this already, but if you don't have a large table like me, clean a little section of floor. That works really well, especially if you have like LVP or tile or, like a really non-fluffy carpet. That works. Okay, so now that I have this in the position that I want, I'm going to grab my can of 505 spray again, and I'm going to just turn up sections like this, and I'm going to spray. And I'm spraying the batting, and then I'm going to bring this back. There we go. And then I'm going to do all of the other corners until everything is somewhat adhered to the batting. And the reason why I said that I'm going to quilt this in one setting is sometimes the 505 will lose its stickiness after 48 hours. So, if you don't think that you're going to be able to get to quilting something in one setting, at least do enough quilting so the quilt is kind of basted together. And that way, you won't have to do hand basting or pin basting or things like that. And then just to be neat, I suppose, I'm going to trim this extra batting over here just so, I don't need this little strip here. All right, so now that we're all basted, let's talk about the walking foot.
Okay, so here is our walking foot, and the walking foot goes on with the little fork over where the needle goes up and down. So you put that on there like that. Then you slip the cone through that little groove that's notched out on it, lift it up, and pull the little lever down on the side. And that's generally how the foot goes on. However, I want to use the guide that goes with the foot, and you get 2 of them, a left guide and a right guide.
And I'm going to be using the right guide. And when you use the guides, you need this little hat. So this little hat goes on your foot like so, and then you slip this in like so. You noticed how I had to unscrew it just a little bit to get it in there, but once you adjust how far you need it to be over, I'm going to do this at an inch, maybe an inch and a quarter, about the width of the needle plate to the needle. I'm going to tighten this screw. I decided to use some organic cotton thread. This is the Scan Fill thread in 30 weight, and I'm putting it on my horizontal spool pin like so. But there is sometimes little notches around these wooden spools. So what I'm going to do is put my spool cap on the opposite way that I normally do, and that will keep the thread from getting stuck on one of those ridges. And I know that sometimes I tell you wooden spools mean that it's really old thread, but in this case, this is organic thread, so they're using wooden spools, and this thread is brand new, and you can purchase it right at Bernina of Naperville. And I'm going to just wind a bobbin of this as well. And, sometimes when you're quilting, you may consider winding a couple bobbins, especially if you have a machine that doesn't have the jumbo bobbin, because then you have them ready and you don't have to stop down to wind. But I think this might be a one bobbin project, so I'm going to tempt fate. Then, while this is winding, I'm going to set up my straight stitch for a 3.5 millimeter long stitch. Because I'm quilting, I like to have a little bit longer stitch length. So now this goes into my black jumbo bobbin case and under my machine. And now I'm going to thread. Now in my machine is a 90 quilting needle because I've got some seams on this quilt. And I also, because I'm quilting, I want a needle that has a longer scarf. That's the little notch behind a needle that allows the thread to take a stitch and form a loop a little bit later so you don't get skipped stitches. And quilting needles are generally 75 or 90, and I'm going to 90 because of the thread being 30 weight and my quilt having some seams. So now, if you have the means, I highly recommend that you take your machine to a table where you can really spread out. In this case, I'm using the slide-on table that came with my Bernina 475, but there is another product. It's called a So Steady table, and they make products that will extend further around and that can really help hold the weight of your quilt. Another thing is if you have a cabinet where you can put your machine down in the cabinet and flip the back end of it up. Oh, that's something really nice because then you have it at an ergonomic height to sit at and you don't get the back pain and things like that. So Horn makes those. Also, if you're looking for something that's affordable, why don't you check out Create Room? And if you visit through the link at berninaofnaperville.com on our homepage, we will get a little bit of a percentage on your purchase if you decided that you want a dream station for yourself because this thing is perfect. You can quilt on it, you can piece on it, you can lower your machine down in the cabinet, you can even tuck it away when not in use. And it works perfectly with the Create Room Dream Box. And if you're interested in a Dream Box, ladies and gentlemen, well, you can use Gayle code at checkout for a $300 discount. So now that I have this all together here, and I'm opting to use a tabletop like this, and it's just so that you can see the quilting process easier overhead than I could film it at one of my cabinets. And so I have so many options that I could do. Now remember, I'm using my straight stitch with the 3.5 millimeter long stitch with the 30 weight thread in the top and bottom. I could do straight lines, I could do a grid, I could do cross hatching. These are all different styles of quilting. I am opting to do a gentle curve from one corner to the next, and then I'm going to use that guide that's on my machine in order to just echo quilt that first initial curve line I do again and again and again. So I'm going to start up here and I'm lowering my foot. And normally I would pick my thread up, but I'm starting off of the quilt, so I don't really care if there's like a little knot back there when I start because I'm starting away from anything that's ever going to be seen on the back of this quilt. So I'm going to take a few stitches and I'm just making everything nice and smooth. I also am making sure that I'm landing with my needle in the down position. And another thing that you might find handy, quilting gloves. These can sometimes really help me hold on to my quilt a little bit better. So you just slip these guys on. These are Reggie's gloves. We sell them at the store, and they come in small, medium, and medium large. And I like mine to be really tight, and I have very, very small hands, but the small medium fits me okay. Okay, so now I'm just going to continue this gentle curve. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be smooth. And I also will remind you that the first maiden voyage is always the most difficult one. And managing the bulk can be a little bit challenging. As you can see here, I need to maybe kind of curl my fabric a little bit so I can push it through easier. And you can also see that I've opted to stitch right through the circles and over the applique. All right, let's have a look at our stitching. And you can see the longer stitch, what that looks like. I'm pretty happy with it. So now it's time to just echo on this original stitch. So what I'll be doing is pressing the cutter, and then I'll lift my presser foot. And now I'm going to start again. Only this time I have a specific path that I'm going to be choosing. So I'm going to start right on this line here, like so, lining that guide of my walking foot up with that line. And so as I stitch, this edge is right up with that line that I just stitched. And once again, I'm not bringing my thread up because I'm starting away from the quilt top. And I know that I'm echoing this and, I'm trying really hard to keep that guide on my line, but I want you to think of echo quilting as a game of gossip. Remember the gossip vine? And I mean by that is sometimes as you make these curves, it changes slightly by an eighth of an inch or so, and that's okay. It's telling a story. As long as you keep your path nice and smooth, it'll be gorgeous. And then you can see I'm going to curl this fabric here as I go on this next pass. And simply cutting again. Then I'm going to bring my work back and do another row. Okay, and so there is just a lot of rinse and repeat with this technique. You can see I'm just doing my best to manage this bulk. But because we did this down the middle first, it gets easier and easier each time you do this because you're getting a smaller area that you have to manage. And eventually we'll twist this around and start quilting from the other end. But right now we're just going to continue to go in this direction. You see that you're getting like a little pucker or something, you can always just take your fingers and kind of smooth that out a little bit. Just keep on doing it. This is how I quilted my temperature quilt that I made when we built our house. I did this very gentle curve. Now on that one, I did use my 990 with a walking foot, but same concept. After several rows of quilting, I would like to turn this around and start going the other direction in here. And it's basically a matter, like you saw, of turning it around. And now I'm going to start in this direction and just keeping that guide lined up. And I've been timing this in real time. You know, I've skipped ahead a lot for you because you don't really need to see me doing this again and again and again, right? But this has been 25 minutes since I started. Not that quilting something should be a race. You should take your time to do it, but you know, sometimes you do just want to get through one kind of design here. And remember, I'm doing these 1¼ inch apart. It's going to take longer if you put your lines closer together. And honestly, for this project, I would not recommend going any further apart than 1¼ inches. And now this walking foot does a very good job of feeding. So I really don't need to worry about, you know, always going in one direction. This is feeding just the same going this way as it did going the other way. And now I did mention that I wanted you to have your needle in the down position because each time I stop and have to rearrange with the needle in the down position, it'll prevent herky jerky stitches on your quilting. As you get to the edges of your quilting and you're almost finished, you may want to take your right guide off and replace it with the left guide. This way, as we stitch, we don't have all that bulk here on the machine there. So I'm just going to slightly tighten this, and then I'm going to slip my foot back on. You saw me do this a couple times already. And now this is already into position at 1.25 inches, and I'm just going to tighten it and now continue on with our stitching. So now we have our beautiful quilt is complete, and I just need to trim it. So what I do is I take out my cutting mats and I measure and make sure everything's square. Start here on the corner. And I'm making sure that my corner is square by using my, just use your largest square, but I happen to be lucky enough to have one of these 20.5 inch squares. And I use this in my rotary cutter. And I'm just checking that my quilt is square. And this is, in fact, which is great. And now I'm just going to trim just a little bit off here, like so, right up to the edge of that fabric. Now I'm going to move it up to this end where I'm also going to check that the corner is square, like so. And now I'm going to move this on down to here. And if I'm cutting anything off of our quilt, it's only just maybe a sliver of our fabric. And sometimes I like to fold and just make sure that it's coming out nice and straight like this. And now we're going to go across this edge here. And we have one last piece to trim. Lining this up and this up with the very edge there. Right up to the edge of the fabric here. And now we're ready for binding. There's a few things that I like to do a binding. Now, I am very impatient, so I do not like to hand sew my bindings on. So I like to sew my binding on to the back side of the quilt and then bring it around to the front. So that's what I'm going to do. I also like to cut my bindings on the bias, and I use this Creative Grids Bias Binding Simplified, where it's got the instructions and everything on here for how you need to fold your fabric to cut it perfectly on the bias. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a large piece that we fold into a triangle like so. And we're going to just let that fold just like that. Then we're going to bring the binding down after it's made this piece like so. So we've got a very long bias edge there. Bias is when you cut something diagonal to the cross grain, the grain that goes this, and the grain line that goes like this. If you cut it on the diagonal in either direction, that is bias. It's the stretchiest part of the fabric. It also will help it so that your bindings don't wear, because if you cut the binding on grain, sometimes they'll rip right down the fold line on the quilt. And so this is a way that you can have something last for a really long time. I like to do things on the bias because I often use stripy bindings, and I think those look really cute. And if you just get a regular striped fabric and you cut it on the bias, you get like that little candy cane look to it. So then once we fold the diagonals together, we're going to fold it up one more time. And that is essentially so that we can trim a little bit of this off. So I'm going to line that up, and we're trimming like the fold just a little bit, but we do have to make sure it gets nice and flush there. So now I'm going to line this up with the straight edge at the bottom of this ruler, and then I'm going to cut. So this ruler can also yield a 2-inch bias, a 2 1/4, or a 2 1/2 inch. And I like 2 1/2 inches for my binding. So we can go ahead and just line this up. Now I am an expert at cutting, so I'm going to cross over here and cut. And we are going to need 48 1/2 plus 48 1/2, which is 97. And then we're going to need 2 times 36 1/2, which is about 73. So 97 and 73 is 170 inches. So this first cut gives me 46 inches plus another 46 inches. So I'm going to cut so that I have about 6 strips. That should give me plenty of binding. And then using this bias ruler is also nice because it gives us very long strips of binding to deal with as well. And sometimes, as we cut in, we get shorter pieces, but in general, I think 6 strips will be fine. I have a little seam in my cutting mats there, so that was 6 strips. Now, what we want to do is we want to take our pieces, and you can see they have this nice little angle on them, like so. Well, we're going to take them and make like a little picture frame where we're lining them up like this, and see how that creates like a little dog ear there and there. And now that is what we're going to stitch on our machine. And you can line it up if this is like 1/4 inch away and stitch, just like that. So we're going to do this to all of our strips. I've decided to keep my walking foot on here. And so I'm just going to simply take my pieces and align them up like I told you I was going to. And we're going to align these. I'm doing about 1/4 inch here. And I have my stitch adjusted back to the default setting of 2.5 millimeters in length. And I'm just aiming for that little dip on my piece like that. And you can see how we have that little puppy ear that hangs off the edge, but that makes our bias piece nice and straight. So a few more times of doing this, and then we'll be ready to press, fold it, and attach it to the quilt.
If your angles aren't lining up, you're just going to make a picture frame like so. And if you wanted, you could draw a line with a water-soluble pen from corner to corner. I just eyeball it because I've got like a little center needle line right here on my table. And that's how you would do one of those strange little angles there. Over here at our iron, we're going to want to just trim the seam allowance down. Any of the ones that we have that, had that weird little angle there. I'm going to trim this.
And then once I find the beginning, I'm going to press this in half longwise. And there's another tool that I like when I do this, and it's a little binder roll here. I'll put it in the description of the video so you know what it's called, but it helps me keep my binding nice and neat. Now that I have our binding wrapped on our piece, it's time to attach it to the backside of our quilt. And here is the bottom of our quilt. So I'm going to turn this upside down. And according to the directions on this ruler, that's pretty nifty. This is the binding tool, and it gives you instructions on how to do a binding, but also how to use the markings and line these up to get your binding sewn together perfectly at your stop and start end. So we're going to start essentially by taking a ruler and whatever kind of marking pencil you want, and we're going to mark 12 inches from an area to an area. So I've got my little chalk pen here that I'm using, and this is a 12.5 inch ruler, so I've got to be careful that I'm marking 12 inches there. Then I'm going to use the same ruler, and I'm going to make sure that I have at least a 10-inch start, which I do here, and I'm going to align this to one of my lines that I created. So this is between this mark and this mark is 12 inches. Now it's time to go over to our machine where I'm going to show you how I align this up with my walking foot to sew my binding on based on this 2.5-inch bias piece that we made. So looking at our walking foot, there is like a little edge here. It's to the right of this little black walking foot walker, right? So right here is where I like to line my binding and edge of my quilt up. And remember, when we're sewing on the binding, it's the raw edges that get aligned to the raw edge of the binding. And I'm sewing to the back of the quilt because I like to bring mine around to the front and top stitch by machine. If you are somebody that wants to sew your binding on by hand on the other side, then you would sew to the front of the quilt. But I'm doing this all by machine. You do a few stitches and then a few stitches backwards. And I hope you can see that my edge of my binding and my fabric is right up to the edge of that walking foot toe. And we're going to miter our binding edges. And that means that I'm going to stop sewing it's about a wee bit more than 1/4 of an inch. How's that? I'd say that is 3/16 maybe, or 5/16. I'm just going to stop there, cut, and lift so that you can see the distance. We're going to take our binding and we're going to align this straight as if we're making a straight line going down like this. Then you can finger crease and bring this back down if you like. and we're making that fold flush, not more than flush, but flush with that edge. And this is flush with the bottom. And we're going to turn that around, get it under the foot, and we can start sewing at the beginning, but we're going to maintain that seam allowance. And now we're going to do that at every corner. Okay, so we're at the beginning or we're at the end of a side. So we're going to stop, reverse, cut and lift, and we've stopped just a little bit more than a quarter of an inch before the end there, and we're folding the bias back and down, creating this fold. And now we're going to pivot, lower it down under our foot, maintain that seam allowance. And I like to cut these little guys off as I come to them. We don't want to add bulk. And now we've reached another corner where we're going to line this up, bring it over again, and stitch. And this is our last corner that we're coming up on. This time we're going to be stitching this to that chalk mark that we made. That's 12 inches from the other piece. And I put a pin on it just in so I wouldn't miss it because I have to do that to myself all the time. Okay, now once we get to that mark, we're going to back tack, cut, and now go to the drawing board so we can see how to use that binding tool. Once we have our binding on and we have this opening still, we're going to take our binding tool and we're going to line it up like so, and we're going to pull it over to this line here, and you can either use your chalk pen, or I like this pen here where I can see things just a little bit more, and we're gonna line up this line even with that line there. Then we're going to turn this around in the other direction and put this over here, and this time we're going to open this up and we're going to mark this line like so. Then, once you do that, this line on this side is going to be aligned with that line like so, and we're going to cut on the very edge of that piece. Then we're going to open up this piece, and on the right, we're going to align the ruler with the tip A on our traced line, like that. And then you can cut. I just happen to grab these duckbill scissors. So that's that piece. And now we're going to open up this piece and trim on that line. And now you can see that I kept the little flat pieces because you're going to align those on this piece and you're going to align them on this piece here. And now we're going to stitch with approximately 1/4 inch seam allowance right along that seam. And then as we put it down, you can see it's going to form that nice little miter. I'm going to finger press this crease and then we're going to let it fold together again. And now we're going to align it under our foot and finish sewing this opening closed. And the crucial thing that you need to do when you're doing your bindings to make them look nice and perfect is to actually press them. So we're going to press this over once, and we're going to do this on all the sides, and then our corners naturally start to miter just like that. And then once we press everything on the back side, we're going to turn it around to the front side and finish. And this is where you can use one of my favorite tools, my glue stick. This is a 505 glue stick, and I like it because it stays wet a little bit longer. And I can really make those miters look so perfect. And then as I move this side around, so we're going to push that guy in. And what I like to do is take my stiletto or something like that to get that edge still nice and crisp, fold our pieces over, and then press it. And so we'll do all of our corners just that way. So they're nice and perfect when we go to stitch them. So I'm going to complete this and then I'll show you how I stitch this on. So I'm going to do a little bit of work to my walking foot here. I'm going to take the guide off. I don't need that for the binding. And then I'm going to switch out this sole plate for the sole plate with the edge guide. And the way that that works is I'm just going to loosen this screw here and just pop that off. And then I might need to loosen it a little bit more. There we go. And now we're going to put this into position in between those little grippy guys here on the walking foot. There's like a little hole that goes in there, and then the same hole aligns on the other side. And then once we get those kind of into place like we need them to be, then we're going to tighten our piece. Just like that. And now that guide is going to help us sew our binding on perfectly.
So for using this foot with the edge stitch guide, I'm going to actually move my needle 3 clicks to the right. You can do 2 or 3, whatever you're comfortable with. If you're timid, do 3. If you're a pro, do 2. But the idea is that when we line this up, now we're sewing with our right side of our quilt up. When we line this up here, we want this guide right onto the edge of our fabric.
You also might want to increase your stitch length to 3 millimeters. Then remember our perfect little mitered edges here. I like to use my stiletto to keep everything nice and flat. And now we're going to lift and pivot. Line that up again. Okay, now let's have a little sneak peek underneath. That looks great. And it looks pretty good from that side too. And don't be alarmed, sometimes it does slip off the back. That's why I'm choosing to sew it to the front and bring it around to the back, because it's going to be the front you're looking at more than not. And then turn right when I get on that fold. There it is. And our thread matches so perfectly we don't even see it on the back side. Okay, so now I've gotten back to where I started, so I'm just going to carefully feed this through and over sew for a few stitches at the beginning and cut.
Wasn't this quilt cute? I mean, I can't believe how well it went together. And truthfully, this only took me 2 days. And now I know I'm a little fast at doing things and everything, but this might be a good project for those of you that have done like placemats, table runners, pot holders to try managing a little bit more bulk. So hope that this was informative for you. And if you'd like more information on the Bernina walking foot, well, we have a video of that on our YouTube channel and many, many others on different styles of binding. So make sure that you hop on over to youtube.com/Bernina of Naperville, like, comment, subscribe, and check out almost all of our 600 videos that we've done. And I thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you now have a little bit more knowledge about quilting with the walking foot. So thank you so much, and happy quilting.